All right, let's look at the Bible. We are in the book of Exodus tonight, chapter 7. Knowledge is a funny thing. When we were kids and sat the HSC or studied in school, we at times hated the requirements of knowledge, especially teachers, the acknowledged brokers of knowledge. Eddie McGuire has made millions, lots of money, and given away heaps on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, testing people's knowledge of the most trivial bits of data. How many trivia nights are there at local pubs all around the city, all around the country? The quizmaster at the pub that I visit each Tuesday night oversees a team of quiz makers who earn him upwards of thousands of dollars each week as he sells the questions nationwide. Newspapers are filled with knowledge, and the internet almost sells itself in speed to get information to you. You should know, and you should know it now. And right now, there are people buying the astrological charts for the rest of the year, or at least for tomorrow, so they can know what tomorrow will be like. Knowledge is good money. Your response to life determines the next stage of your life. Do you believe this? What you did on New Year's Eve or last night as we celebrated Purim, or what you are doing this morning or what you'll do next week, they all play into a greater scheme of things called your life. And your life is integrally linked with others and with the Almighty. Even if you're not sure if there is a God who notices, much more demands or cares about you. Let me ask you, do you have a soft or a hard heart towards God? Do you know that He knows you better than you know yourself? So don't try to pull the wool over His eyes. The condition of your heart, soft or hard, will determine what happens to you in the months and years to come and bring you satisfaction or redemption or trouble or plagues. And the bottom line of all of God's dealings with us as people is, may I quote, "Then they shall know that I am the Lord," end quote. This phrase is found here in Torah, Exodus 7, in both relating to the Jewish people and the Gentile nation who had enslaved us. It's found in Ezekiel 28 about the returning Israel and its future blessing. And it's found in Ezekiel's narrative 57 other times. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. More than any other prophet, Ezekiel wanted everyone to know that what happens and what would happen would be designed for one major purpose, for people to know that Yahweh is God and no other. There are 4 Hebrew letters that compose the word that we say Yahweh, and that they say Jehovah. You know that there's no letter J in the Hebrew alphabet. They have, there's no pronunciation guide in the Torah itself. There's no voweling. There's no trup marks, cantillation. But the rabbis have inserted those as helps for us. So what you're reading here in the Hebrew has both trup marks and vowels. Great. But those don't exist in the original. So what do? We know by what has been told us. And it's only that which then became, if you will, codified or written into modern Sidurim and a modern Tanakh. So the idea of Yahweh is the custom that some say. Of course, Orthodox Jews, like I grew up, like you grew up, would never pronounce that name. He'd be Adonai, which means Lord. You wouldn't say the tetra, meaning 4, grammaton, meaning letters, the 4-letter name of God. You would never pronounce. But somehow when I read the scriptures, I see that a lot of people pronounce the name of God. God pronounced the name of God. Moses wrote it down. Rahab said it. Rahab, a harlot, knew the name of God. I think I can say the name of God. I don't want to take the name of God in vain, and as a result of that commandment, many Jewish people won't ever take the name of God in any possible way. So Adonai, meaning Lord, is a good nickname for God. But of course, you could take the name Adonai in vain. As a result of that, what do they say? Don't say Adonai in conversation, say Adoshem. Lest you take the name Adonai in vain. Again, what's that hedge? The hedge rule, isn't it? The buffer that we do. Make a hedge about Torah. One of the ways that we protect it from our breaking, really protect us from our breaking Torah. So the idea of Jehovah, it's the custom. Yeah, it's a custom, it's a tradition that gives us the voweling and the cantillations that help us, or designed to help us, but as a result, we are left to our own devices, confused. This was Ezekiel. That was Ezekiel's purpose, for people to know that Yahweh is God and no one else. And this was downright evangelistic in his day and ours. There was a great black educator, sociologist, and historian whose name was Burghardt Du Bois. And upon completion of his studies at Fisk and Harvard universities and the University of Berlin, he was convinced that change in the condition of the American black could be affected by careful scientific investigations into the truth about the black person, about the black race, if you will, in America. So he proceeded. His research was flawless, his graphs, his charts impeccable. After waiting several years and hearing not the slightest stir of reform, Dr. Du Bois had to accept the truth about truth. Its being available doesn't mean that it will be appropriated. Just because there's a truth out there doesn't mean anyone will take it on board. Information is often confused with knowledge, and knowledge is often confused with wisdom. And there's no way to keep up, is there? Knowledge, they say, is exploding at such a rate, more than 2,000 pages a minute, that even Einstein couldn't keep up. This was my Facebook blog today. If you read 24 hours a day from the time you were 21 to the time you were 70 and retained everything you read, you would be 1.5 million years behind when you finished. That's how much data is out there that we are not even getting close to looking at. Arthur Clarke said, "For every man, education should be a process which continues all his life. We have to abandon as swiftly as possible the idea that schooling is something restricted to young people. How can it be in a world where half the things a man knows at 20 are no longer true by the time he reaches 40, and half the things he knows at 40 hadn't even been discovered when he was 20? Every weekend, a team of our tennis club plays the quiz from the Sydney Morning Herald, and we give ourselves half marks when we even mention the right answer, even if we don't say that that's the right answer at the end. Quizzes and knowledge and information, that's something on which many of us right-brainers will thrive, but is it enough? Let's look at the text. In today's story, we see the central characters, Moses and Aaron, on the Hebrew side, and Pharaoh on the Egyptian side. I feel like I'm watching Fox Sports when I read this section. The sports commentators interview the parents of the stars on both sides. They tell of the family background and what would make them good players. What does verse 1 say? It tells that the ministry of a prophet in God's perspective is one of mediation. You will be as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. This means that Aaron will be more than a sidekick in a buddy movie. He will speak for deity. He will mediate between Moses and Pharaoh. This was God's answer, remember, in Moses' excuse in chapter 4, his seeming inability to speak well. Now, we've spoken about the ordinariness of Moses before. He was not so great. Let me compare the celebrations I watched with, we see it every year, don't we? We go to the fireworks, and we watch them explode, and the bridge goes ablaze. I love it. Do you ever go out? We sometimes go to McMahon's Point. One year I remember going right to the Opera House, like at 2 p.m, and stationing ourselves, thinking we had a good spot, and then by 10 o'clock we were squeezed into no space at all. But the bridge goes ablaze for about 20 minutes, and then the smoke drifts past, and the ships again move on the harbor. The crowds of 1 million people all along the foreshore, 750,000 of my closest friends and I then try to catch a bus and the train back to our homes. I think it took me about an hour and a half last year to make the usual 20-minute trip. What makes the fireworks so spectacular included the making of an ordinary thing into an extraordinary thing. The bridge is, well, it's a bridge. It's just a bridge. And it's pretty ordinary at that. I mean, it was pretty amazing, a great feat when it was built 70 years ago. But hey, it's a bridge. It's steel. It's concrete. Nothing to get 750,000 people to come watch it every night. Maybe that's the subplot of this whole Exodus story. The unlikely hero Moses, the ordinary leader of the pack, takes the 3 million ordinary Jewish people out for a retreat in the wilderness. Or at least he's trying to convince Pharaoh that this should take place. Just a simple house party, that's all he wants. The whole point, though, was not for the Jewish people to escape. The whole point was for God, the whole point for God was that all the world would know that he was God. That all the world would know he was God. That's the point. It's a huge point, and one that we to this day still miss. God is not content to get people off from prison or out of sickness or into good feelings, if that's their preference. He wants all people in all places to know that he is God, and there is no other. Knowledge matters, not just to your school teacher or to Eddie McGuire. It's for you, and it's for me, and the object of our instruction is the living God. Look what it says, verse 2. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, in order that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, verse 4, then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. So I asked you about your heart earlier. Is it soft or hard? This is more than a momentary condition. This is a way to determine your future, better than a tarot card or a palm reader. Is your heart soft towards God or not? What do we read? Pharaoh hardened his heart, and as a result, God hardened it yet further. Va'ani akashe et lev paro. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Remember, what God wants, though, is not to show his own bossness. He doesn't want to make life easy for us Jews. He has one thing to communicate and to get through to us. This is to get Egypt to the place of admitting that Yahweh is God. Verse 5, the Egyptians shall know, Vayad'u Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai. But it doesn't say the people of Mitzrayim. It says, Yad'u Mitzrayim. Egypt will know. You hear the difference? Actually, the Hebrew, not the people of Egypt only, but the land of Egypt. Mitzrayim shall know that Yahweh is God and that there is no other. The river Nile is considered as a god to the Egyptians. The Almighty is saying, don't look to the Nile. Don't look to Sydney Water. Don't look to the Warragamba Dam or to the Prospect Reservoir. Don't look to the mighty Murray. Don't look to the Tasman. Look to me. This is crucial in our lives as well as the history of the Egyptians 3,500 years ago. To whom do we look when things are messy? To what do we run to find peace and meaning? In 2014, where will we find new life? What it says, that Pharaoh hardened his heart in verse 13. It's a back and forth kind of thing. Do you see it? Verse 13. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. It actually says, Vayachazak lev paro, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. But it's the word strengthened, chazak. Right. So then the real question would be, not why do the Egyptians forget that God is God? Why do the Jews forget that God is God? Why do we, who came from nobody, from nowhere, with miracle upon miracle, with deliverance after deliverance, not even 100 years later, not even a decade later, forsake God and go build an idol in just a few chapters? Why do we do that? Because we are consumed with ourness instead of hisness. Pharaoh hardened, literally strengthened his heart, verse 13. And as a result, what happens to a man when he's got a hard heart, verse 13? He did not listen to Aaron and Moses. The word speak, davar, is used 5 times in this text. Shema is used 4 times. Siva is used 4 as well. This is not just a conversational device by the author. It's a reminder of how this works. Speak is davar. Shema means to what? To listen or hear. Siva, tzav, means to command. If you listen, you do. And if you don't listen, you won't do. That's how simple it is. When Pharaoh hardened his heart, the result was, verse 22, he did not listen. So first he doesn't hear in verse 13, and then verse 22, he did not listen to them. This is a progression. Let's look at another text. It's probably easier to use Romans chapter 1 to help explain this. And maybe Romans 1 helps this, and maybe this helps Romans 1, because it could be a little confusing. Romans chapter 1 in the Newer Testament. Now this is Paul writing to the believers in Rome about all kinds of things. And in verse 18, we read that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. And verse 20, one of my favorites, on the wall at the Ken Duncan Gallery, everywhere you go, any Ken Duncan, in Melbourne, up in Central Coast, here in the Rocks, it's on the wall, it's on a plaque. Verse 20, because since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So Duncan and Paul both agree that no one has an excuse before God to say, I didn't know there was a God, because evidence is all around that there is somebody who's a creator. Okay? All you have to do is be a photographer or look at a photograph. Walk on the ocean or see a photo of an ocean. You'll know you're nobody and there's somebody. That's it. That's what he's saying. For even though they knew God, they didn't, verse 21, honor him as God or give thanks. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Here's what happens. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. You take God in his uniqueness and trade it in for some universalist understanding of humanity and humanism and self-centeredness. Therefore, verse 24, without those previous verses, this makes no sense. Therefore, verse 24, God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. So what can we say? In light of Exodus, what's going on in Romans 1:20 to 23? What's happening? God's evidencing things to all of the planet. And what do the people do towards God in light of Exodus 7? Their people are hardening their hearts. Therefore, verse 24, God hardens their hearts. He gives them over to impurity, so their bodies would be dishonored among them, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worship, serve the creature rather than the Creator. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. So a second level of giving them over or hardening their heart, because they rejected God as Creator, etc. God gave them over. For their women exchanged natural function for that which is unnatural. In other words, homosexuality. In the same way, also, the men abandoned natural function of the woman and burned in their desire for one another. So gay and lesbian stuff is a function of God hardening the hearts of people who had a choice earlier and hardened their heart towards him. And by knowing he was God and then rejecting him as God, that's their hardening. He hardens. They harden. He hardens. Do you see how the pattern works? It's not done yet. And then verse 28, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over. God hardened their heart. God gave them over to a depraved mind to do things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. Although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do those things, but give hearty approval to those who practice them. This is a spiral that's not linear, but it's almost like a man in a big lake or in an ocean. He's in a rip. When you're under, they'll have the old, in the cartoons or in stories, you'd go down 3 times, right? 3 times and you're dead, right? You come up, put your finger up once, glub, 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 put your finger up twice, and after 3 times you're dead. Well, in a way, that comes from this kind of triad of God giving them over to doing such disapproved things that it is shame upon shame upon shame, and by then they approve those who practice them. So they're seared in their conscience. They're acting out every bit of evil, and it is a hardening of hearts. So you say, why would God harden hearts? Because we hardened them towards God. So Romans 1 is all a help to help us understand why God hardening Pharaoh's heart is appropriate. At the end, what does God want? At the end of these hardening lessons, why does he harden people's heart? So that they will know that he is God. So every time you're dying in the water and you come up for air, gasp, you're there to look for God, not to reject God, not to turn away from God. That you might know that he's the Savior, that you might know that he's the deliverer, etc. Let's go back to Exodus. Consider the major testing of the Jewish people later on in the wilderness, when we are at Meribah, in the day of Massah in the wilderness. When your fathers tested me, they tried me, though they had seen my work. Let's look at that. It's in Psalm 95. Oh, come, let's sing for joy to the Lord. Let's shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let's come before his presence, thanksgiving, blah, blah. This is great. His hands in the depths of the earth. Come, verse 6, let's worship and bow down. Let's kneel before the Lord our Maker. He's our God. We're the people of his pasture. Look at that, verse 7. Why don't you read that, 7 to the end? Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. So when do you harden your heart? After you hear his voice. So when he speaks, what is hardening your heart? It's saying no to the command or the words of God. If you say yes to the command of God or the words of God, you're softening your heart. So it's so simple. What if I've hardened my heart against God? Well, what did he say? What did you do? If you listen and you do, you'll have a soft heart. And you'll have a softer heart in the same way that Paul wrote the Romans about guys who hardened their hearts, almost like calluses, against God. You know, a callus on your finger. You know, if you do a lot of baking or a lot of chopping with your axe or play guitar and you put your fingers on the frets a lot, violin, you're going to get calluses. And a callus is developed over time. The more you use that axe and chop wood, the tougher your hands are going to get, right? Hardening your hands against the pains of life. What is a callus really but a numbing place, a numb place where you have no feeling anymore? So if God says, it'd be wrong if you spoke against your parents. If he says to you, it'd be wrong if you hate that brother in your heart. If he says to you, it's just bad if you do X, Y, or Z, and you go ahead and do it again and again and again, pretty soon what happens? You get hard to that commandment. You get callous to the command of God, to the voice of God. And why do we do that? We do that because we don't want to obey, because we want to live our own lives, because we're independent, and because there was no trouble when we did disobey. Right? It was okay. We got away with it. When they said to you in school, don't cheat, and you cheated, and nobody caught you, you thought, this isn't that hard. I can cheat again. And I'm going to bring in, and now we become much more sophisticated. Now we do it on our computers or on our telephones, or we have earbuds that we use, by the which we're cleverer and cleverer over against the voice of the authorities. But end of the day, we're the ones that lose because we become harder to the realities of obedience. How many people are speeding on the M2 and the M7 right now who haven't been caught lately? And then they'll get a fine in the post and say, wait a minute, what's the deal? I do this all the time. Well, okay, you got lucky the last 37 times you sped, but but it's about time you got caught. And we've hardened our hearts to that. Look, how did they harden their hearts? By not listening to the voice of the Lord and demanding what they wanted. The people of Israel did not listen to God and chose to listen to popular reason and personal demands. God help us in our days to avoid the popular and the reasonable demands of the media and the society. May we follow the Lord in all our hearts and with all our beings. Don't harden your hearts. Listen to God and do what he says. Listening means we will do. What happened to our fathers? Psalm 95:9. When your fathers tested me, they tried me, even though they'd seen my work. Right? There you go. And what happened? Verse 10. For 40 years, I hated this generation. Ooh. And they said, there are people who are in their heart and they don't know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, they shall not enter into my rest. By the way, the writer of Hebrews 3 times cites this psalm and uses that as evidence that there is something yet ahead for the Jewish people, not just that we were supposed to go into the land of Israel, in which we were living when the writer of Hebrews wrote the book of Hebrews. If that were all it was, that we were supposed to get into the land, then that was it. But he uses that concept of we're wandering and still looking for the rest to say there's an eternal rest, and it's with Yeshua and it's heaven, and we haven't even gotten there yet, but he's the usherer. Therefore, he says, don't reject my voice. That's chutzpahdik, if you like it. Don't reject my voice as I teach you these things. Yeshua was speaking with Moses and Elijah one day. That was remarkable. Yes. The Bible records what happened. Matthew chapter 17. We're not going to turn there. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. What did the voice say to Peter, James, and John right after that?
Listen to him.
Listen to him. This was God speaking. Don't miss it, friends in Sydney, and don't miss it, friends on the internet. From God's beckoning to us, we learn what matters is not our creativity of ministry or our activities in his name, but listening to him and doing what he wants. And what he principally wants is for us to follow Yeshua and to make him known on the earth. Malachi, the final Older Testament prophet, said this, chapter 2, verse 2, Malachi. If you do not listen and if you do not take it to heart to give honor to my name, then I will send the curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. And indeed, I've cursed them already because you're not taking it to heart. Okay, now the condition of your heart. It's not a permanent condition. What you've done in the past is changeable. You can harden it as Pharaoh did, or you can soften it. How? How do we do that? By admitting to the Lord that we've hardened it and asking Him to forgive us and make our heart new in Him. Isn't that it? Yeah. And think of Ezekiel the prophet. He used an image about a heart that was hard. What did he call it? The heart of stone, and compared it with the heart of flesh, which is soft. Right? Ezekiel chapter 36, the prophet says this in verses 22 to 26. Thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I'm about to act, but for my holy name, which you've profaned among the nations where you went. I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in their midst. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, when I prove myself holy among you in their sight. So how are the nations going to get it? When God proves Himself holy in our sight. For I will, here's how He's going to do it, take you from the nations, gather you from all the lands, and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your filthiness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart, put a new spirit within you. I'll remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. That's the term that depicts what Moses and I are trying to communicate. In chapter 7 of Exodus, Moses wants us moldable and fleshy, not rocky and stone-like. He wants us to yield to His purposes and to know Him personally. And that's the message today. Let's look just at a few other words in Exodus 7, but don't miss the overall content. Verse 7 tells us back here that how old they were. We've already hinted at this before. Yeah, so these guys are older, shall we say. I'm not saying old, not put out to pasture. But they are people of substance, and in a society where age was honored, they should have been honored among the Jewish people. The Jewish people should have held them in high regard, and Pharaoh should have. And what did they do in this one? They threw down the serpents and they do the blood thing. It was a parlor trick. That's what Pharaoh thought. You throw down your stick and it becomes a snake? Come here, boys, you do the same thing. And he did. The miracle was not the staff to snake, but the snake eating all the other snakes. Snakes don't eat other snakes, but in this case they did. And it was pretty remarkable. That would be a hungry snake. That would be a delicacy in any part of China. Some say that the staff became a snake because the staff was a snake. You heard that one? And it hardens and stiffens and acts like a stick until you drop it, and then it kind of moves around. That it was the magicians were clever in how they held it, right? But the eating of by the stick and the snake, anyway, the eating of the other snakes was pretty miraculous. The Egyptians, like the Hindus today, had hundreds, thousands of gods and snakes, and anything over which they had no control were among all gods. Verse 13, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he didn't listen. And that's how you know a heart is hardened. He won't listen. Pharaoh's heart, verse 14, is, he says, is stubborn. The Hebrew is kaved lev paro. Kaved, like the Hebrew word kavod. Stubborn is good. You know the Hebrew word kaved, what else it means? Kavod. Malol chol haaretz kavodo. The whole earth will be filled with glory. It's the word glory. It also means heaviness. And that's the word it's being used here. Pharaoh's heart is heavy, stubborn, tough, immovable. You know, there's one thing about a little lifeboat or a little speedboat out on the harbor. It's another thing when one of those cruise ships comes in. It's not turning very quickly as it gets in the Parramatta River. No. And so when Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, And we see it clearly. Me'ein l'shalach ha'am. He's refusing to send out the people. Refusing. So then he says, tell you what, I'm going to give you another chance. I'm going to turn the Nile into blood. And Moses says, that's going to happen. I'm warning you. Everything's going to stink. Where is it? Verse number 20. All the water is going to turn to blood. All the fish are going to die. The Nile's going to become smelly. It's foul. The Egyptians can't drink the water. And blood's going to go throughout all the land. But the Egyptians amplified that, did the same thing with their secret arts. Well, great. You know, why wouldn't the magicians turn it from blood back to water?
Yeah.
You know,
that's a good question.
Yeah, we can do that too. And so Pharaoh's heart, being hard, influenced his own people to have hard hearts. Now remember, the whole point was so that Egypt, not just the land of Egypt, the people of Egypt, the Egyptians, but the land of Egypt would bow to God and know that he is God. So he's going to take the Nile River, he's going to take serpents, he's going to take everything and make them know that God is God, that Yahweh is God. That's the whole point of this. They looked for all the water. They turned up, they went to all their wells. They couldn't find anything. And for 7 days, the Nile River and everything from it was bloody. Pretty harsh. So what lessons should we learn today? Number 1, hardening your heart against God has consequences. Yeah. Number 2, plagues are not God's original idea for the people of Egypt. If Pharaoh had just said, you want a weekend? See ya. Come back, see you Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock, report back in. That's all he asked for.
3 days.
3 days. But Pharaoh wouldn't. His heart was hardened by God, by himself, by God, by himself. As a result, plagues came. Number 3, mediation is a principle for a prophet and his main job. That's what prophets do. They mediate. Number 4, the Egyptians should have been smart and copied the good things of Moses and Aaron and not the plagues. I just can't imagine being one of those magicians. Now we'll see them later on in the story, that they turn to Pharaoh and say, enough of this stuff. These guys have the good God on their team. You know, this is South Sydney against Manly. Come on, this is not going to work this year. And so they were acquiescing by the end, but Pharaoh was the leader, and the people had opportunity to pull away or not. Number 5, and we always say it, something about him, Jesus is God's ultimate answer and the one to whom we should be listening with all our fleshy hearts. That seems to be the words that I get from tonight's lesson. Today, if you hear his heart. Not yesterday, you can't go back and fix that. Don't worry about mañana. But today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Don't tell me that, you walked with God for 20 years. That's good. I'm glad for that. But today, don't harden your heart. Well, what about those who never have? Well, today, they cannot harden their heart. So everyone can have a choice to soften their heart toward God, get that new spirit, get that new life from God, get their heart sprinkled. Every one of us can do it. That's pretty glorious. Pretty glorious. You listening on the internet, us here in the hallowed ground of our Bible class, anybody, everybody. And it's a good option that God gives us. And if we do, he almost guarantees us a heart of flesh, which is a soft heart. Knowledge is good. Soft heart is better. Amen.
Amen.